all of our biggest takeaways from week one. And that's what we're talking about today on Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find Stealing Signals at bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. Follow his great work over at RotoViz. And we are back for a Sunday night show, which we did a couple of years ago in 2021. Last year, you heard it over at RotoViz Overtime. And I know, Shawn, you'll also be doing some early week stuff with Calm. We're going to do some Stealing Banana shows here on Sunday nights. We're not really sure if we're going to do it for the whole year or what, but we're gonna do some because we want to chat certainly about week one and certainly for the first few weeks. And a wild week one. It wasn't. I mean, it was. Some of it was very exciting. Some of it was frankly just not very good. It was, kind of mixed results, but and then there's the heartbreaker, the J.K. Dobbins injury already, which was a huge bummer. It's good to be back in season. It's also, fantasy football has a funny way of give you a gut punch every now and then. It's just kind of a bummer to be right back in and have Dobbins is a guy, Shawn. I don't think it was on the show, but you and I had talked, and I think just in the last week we ended up doing one draft that we didn't record, and I think you said to me, not on the show if I'm not mistaken, but that he was probably the most mispriced guy in fantasy, and I was like, I think you're totally right. I was agreeing with you, but I thought it was a great call. I mean, of all the guys in that subset of backs that we talked about really liking, Dobbins was really one that didn't make any sense because he did get healthy. He was healthy, and he looked fantastic. In my Stealing Signals notes, I'm writing in the first half about how good he looked. He was catching some passes in this new offense. So they're throwing a little bit more. So, that was a bummer.
It was tough. And I mean, my heart goes out to him because right now the Chiefs are dealing with a frustrating thing with Chris Jones where he actually has a very large contract for this year that he feels like he should get more from. And even though he's getting a lot, he's extremely good. And you can understand why. You have the play today with Dobbins, and you can understand why he was holding in a little bit. You can understand why Jonathan Taylor is upset, because as hard as it was for us, I mean, just imagine being Dobbins today, where you're having that amazing start, and you've worked your way back. And I mean, you are legitimately and very literally one of the most electric players in football, and then that happens. And then one of the things, there's all this debate about, should you be drafting Breece Hall? Should you be drafting Javonte Williams? Should we be drafting these guys coming off of the ACL tears? And the Achilles is a much more serious injury. I mean, we're looking at, his career now in many ways being ruined. And so,
yeah, I mean, it's horrible. That's the first thing I thought of as well. It's just like everything that he's gone through over the last couple of years. He tears the ACL. He tries to come back last year and re-injures in a way that he needs to end up having an additional surgery cleanup last season. It's just like one of the last guys you would want to see get hurt in any kind of way, because it's just, like you said, I mean, it's really the case. I mean, the career ruined kind of comment. I mean, there are players who just never get to be healthy for a long enough period of time to really show us what they're capable of doing. Dobbins is a rookie, 134 carries, 6 yards per carry. Looked great. And then he tears his ACL before he even gets to play a snap in year 2. Last year was year 3. He plays in 8 games, but he's never really healthy. But still, 5.7 yards per carry was great.
Yeah, and he had one of the best numbers in terms of yards over expected, despite the fact that he's out there limping. I mean, this guy is unbelievable. And now, I mean, you're just going to be really deep into his trajectory through his career before he would project to be 100% again. And I just...
Yeah, we talk about the Achilles as kind of an 18-month injury. And so, you know, when the ACL happens early in the year, you can say, oh, well, it's going to be a full 12 months and they'll have time to be ready for week 1 next year. But the Achilles kind of takes out this whole season and potentially next season. Man, I hadn't really thought through all the ramifications, but you just feel so horrible for him. He turns 25 in December. He'll be close to 20. He'll be beyond 26, 18 months from now. I mean, you might be talking about 2025 season when he's 26 years old, the next time that we can really feel great about him. Hopefully, you know, next year he can play really well, even just 12 months removed from the Achilles. But obviously he won't play again this season, and that will be 2 basically entirely lost seasons in the last 3, and then the majority of the third. He'll have handled, I think he had 10 touches today. He'll have handled 109 touches over the last 3 seasons combined, which is, you know, his whole rookie contract. He's at 251 for his career entering this year touches. So, I mean, it's just he played his whole rookie contract, and he, because of injuries, has only really been able to handle about 260 touches across that whole span, which is just, yeah, I mean, put it all in the context, it's just kind of a bummer. There's not much more to say about that, but Shawn, let's get to some of the other games, because I mean, we've done remember last year we did the injury impact, all of that stuff on, you know, on the Trey Lance and on everything. I immediately felt for you, because you've really liked Dobbins and his talent, but there's only so much that can be said about it. I mean, I think everybody kind of knows what it means for, obviously, like you said, for the player, but then also for us and for our teams. We have Dobbins in, I think, more than half our main events. We did 5 together. We have him in 3. So we're not going to dwell on that. We're going to move on to some of the other games.
And Ben here, I mean, this is going to be something that a lot of our listeners are also dealing with. And depending on, you know, what your exposure is, and certainly if you are playing in, you know, one league that's your home league that you wanted to win, that's the most important to you, and you drafted him and he was going to be a big part of it, then, you know, that part is really hard. There, you know, are millions of people playing fantasy football, and a lot of them are frustrated with that today, because both their heart goes out to the player and it does mess up their team. Obviously, if you think someone is the most undervalued player in fantasy, you're going to have some decent shares. The kind of other 2 players that we had mentioned were Travis Etienne, who, I mean, man, his touchdown run today was the perfect example of why I don't directly compare him to Jamal Charles, but I put their name in the same sentences a lot, because there are stylistic similarities and there are some talent similarities. Obviously, Etienne's got to do a lot of stuff before he can get to where he is with Jamal Charles. And then the QB version of that we mentioned was Tua. And man, I mean, the Miami Dolphins looked awfully good today. But the thing with Dobbins is that if you draft the way that we encourage, then number one, week 1 should never be your best week, because you have a lot of players with a wide range of outcomes and a lot of contingency-based upside, and a lot of young players who are going to get better as the season goes along. But that overall depth should stand you in good stead. And I mean, to some people, this is just going to sound like a gratuitous mention of something that I've done in the past. And to some people, hopefully it will be, you know, a little bit encouraging. But the team that I drafted, that I was very lucky to have win the NFFC primetime in 2013, my second round pick on that team was Julio Jones, and he does go down in week 5 and miss the rest of the season. And then in the first week of the race, Rob Gronkowski, who was the third round pick, is lost in the first half of what would have been then week 14 and doesn't go the rest of the way. it doesn't help your chances, but you can lose great players. I mean, if you were to say that J.K. Dobbins was going to go and have the kind of season that Julio Jones had during his peak and that you're losing that, I mean, that's probably a ceiling outcome for Dobbins. But you can lose a player like a Julio Jones and still have a lot of success if you've loaded your team with a lot of talent. It's going to make it harder. But today doesn't end the season, even for those teams where J.K. Dobbins was a key piece.
You are always the optimist on this show between the two of us. I'm always the pessimist, so I'll tell a different side of the story. The team that we drafted that we didn't record, I was really excited about because we got the 12th pick and I had been wanting to build one from the back end where we could go receiver. We got Garrett Wilson to fall there. We didn't get Amon-Ra. He went 11. It was the day before I flew to Vegas. You and I got one last team in. But it was before the Amon-Ra game on Thursday night. We almost got both him and Garrett Wilson, but we got Garrett Wilson and A.J. Brown at the turn. It was a pretty receiver-heavy first round, but, Lamb and Diggs and those guys went. Wilson fell, and we're recording this Sunday night. We have not seen Garrett Wilson or Breece Hall yet. I'm very excited for Monday Night Football to get a chance to see those guys. Hoping they're going to really put a cap on the first weekend. And, yeah, I don't think they're going to let me down. I'm pretty excited for the Jets to play, and the Bills as well. A lot of great players there too. But we did that, and then we went back and took 4 straight running backs, as we've talked a lot about this year, Shawn. And we got, I want to say it was Ramondre and Etienne at 3-4. We didn't take Breece on this team. And then at 5-6, it was Dobbins and Javonte, I think. And as we talked through it, one of the things I said is just like, we were talking about, obviously, we feel really great about those running backs, and there's a lot of firepower there, and there's different ways that can play out. And, you could have a guy maybe miss some time and this and that. But one of the things I said to you was the one thing you can't have is one guy miss the whole year. You can't hit I think I said to you, you can't hit the ACL. We didn't hit the ACL. We hit the Achilles. I mean, that's dark humor. I'm not, obviously, again, feel horrible for J.K. Dobbins, a human being, and I'm not laughing because it's funny. But we felt really great about that team, and then we came back and we got the receiver depth, and then we had some fun options with later quarterbacks and tight ends. It's a fun build. I can't remember the whole team, but I know we had those 4 running backs and felt like with Garrett Wilson and A.J. Brown as these stud 2 receivers, you don't necessarily need to be playing all 4 all year. You can start 4 in this format. But you really wanted to be able to play 3, and then if one was struggling or injured or whatever, that they had the ability to come back and you could kind of layer it in because you took that much draft capital at the running back position. You don't want to hit the complete zero, basically. And so that was my favorite team.
We've got the 4. Now we've got the 3. The 3 will work. The 3 will work. They just need to.
Right. When you talk about the contingency and the redundancy and those things, we do have options. That team is not done. We did hit more receiver depth later. And if we hit some breakout receivers, can't remember who it was. It's probably like Burks and Quentin Johnston, I think. If one of those guys does wind up performing really well this year.
And they were world beaters in week 1.
Yeah. Took the top off everything. But a lot of time. If we do get some positive thing, yeah, I mean, the optimist side of it is very positive.
So Shawn, we want to encourage people to react but not overreact. And this year it's not even hard to make a case for that because the 2 teams that have dominated the AFC over the last 2 years, you could make a case look like the 2 worst teams in football in week 1. And if we are pretty confident that the Chiefs and the Bengals aren't the 2 worst teams in football, then we also have to keep an open mind about the other 30 teams.
Yep. That's great putting it. I actually have that note in my Kenny Pickett breakdown where he had some really, really poor numbers. And I was like, yeah, but are we going to pretend like Joe Burrow sucks because he had some poor numbers in week 1? Like, that's kind of the context I was putting into it.
I mean, they just paid Joe Burrow a lot of money, but you wonder if he's the right guy to play in Ohio because there was a lot of A.J. Dalton action today. From going to the glove, you've got some rain. I was feeling for Curtis a little bit. I was thinking, I'm glad I don't live in Ohio. And, I mean, those passes were not traveling across the line of scrimmage.
Yeah, that was brutal. Another brutal week one note that we have to discuss. It's one of the things I wanted to discuss with you. Again, we're getting into the dark humor here early in the season. Arthur Smith's building the whole plan out of running back points. You did mention to me that maybe I wasn't factoring in the scope of the running back pie in Atlanta enough as we talked through some of the Falcons running back stuff on one of the shows. 18 pass attempts, only 48 total plays, 9 targets for Bijan and Tyler Algier combined. That is 50% of the pass attempts because there was only 18. Kyle Pitts and Drake London back in hell.
Well, so I feel like I described how this team was going to work very accurately. I'm still enthusiastic that Desmond Ridder is going to be more dynamic than he was today. But I mean, you've got to let him do a little something, right? Because at one point he had completed like 10 passes in a row and they picked up like 3 yards. It's like throw it somewhere that matters, right? Throw it somewhere that makes any difference whatsoever.
I saw his ADOT was something like 3.5. It was very low, which happens when you throw half of your passes to your running backs. Bijan Robinson looked great. Awesome TD on the reception where he evades a tackle and then runs through another. He gives you the forced missed tackle and the yards after contact in the same play.
I mean, would you have thought that he could have a 20-point game to start the season when Tyler Algier scores, 24, 25? I mean, one of the things that we talked about with this, and one of the reasons why we were on Ramondre Stevenson and on Breece Hall, and obviously we don't know how the Hall one is going to play out, and I wouldn't take any individual game as being definitive for like what the season means, how the season's going to work. But there are a small handful of teams that, even though we know that, and one of the things that Blair has written about, and obviously plenty of other people have written about, but Blair has looked at it specifically through the EP lens, is that your market share of expected points at the running back position is more predictive of your future scoring than your actual EP is. And yet, if you take that kind of information and use it in a way that doesn't consider what individual teams are actually like and what their tendencies are and where their talent is and how they scheme, how their play caller calls the plays, then you'll be taking the wrong conclusions from that. And one of the things that we have with the Falcons, and certainly you're expecting to have with a team like the Jets, taking those trends, from the Packers with, coordinator and QB and all those types of things, you have these teams that create massive amounts of running back points. And one of the things here that I kept talking about with Dalvin Cook and Ezekiel Elliott is that Tyler Algier is far better than those two guys. And yet people are drafting Bijan Robinson in the first round. And the people drafting Bijan Robinson in the first round are not necessarily wrong. Because, Ben, I don't know if and you can even include people like a David Johnson, include people like a rookie Saquon Barkley. And I don't know that I have seen a guy on an NFL field look as big and as athletic as Bijan looked today. He's absolutely unreal. Just absolutely unreal.
Yeah, really no other way to explain that. As you're talking through that, and especially the market share point and the specific offenses, I was drawn back to our recent conversations about Sean Payton and how, so particularly when he was with the Saints, you would have got lost if you're really worried about, who's getting the market share of the touches, because that's when they had Darren Sproles and then other guys, there was a lot of total EP for the running backs, and that's sort of the point you're making here. Some of these offenses are going to have a ton of total expected points for the running back position. What about Pitts and London? One of the things, Sean, we talked about specifically as it related to these two was this threat of Arthur Smith, like that we had to take it seriously, that we couldn't just analyze these players the same. And then as it related to those two, that you you kind of just, if you're gonna make the bet and then take some risk on, you had to just take the cheaper one that has tight end eligibility, because so much of the potential negative for both Pitts and London revolved around the actual offensive design and volume and factors that don't really relate to Kyle Pitts and Drake London as players. We talked through this a little bit as it related to our dynasty team way earlier in the offseason, and I was kind of making the case that I didn't really know that Drake London could have a good enough year to maintain his lofty price. We ended up trading him. And I'm obviously very concerned about Pitts too, but it does feel like that particular take is at least true. I'm more concerned about London at his cost and what it's going to mean for him the rest of the way.
And they didn't have a lot else happening. They did have Mac Hollins with the 4 targets. He catches 3 for 31 most of the time. It's going to be London there. But it's extremely disconcerting coming off of a season where Pitts had just been so good as a rookie, and he was obviously not a focal point. And one of the, sort of worrying things that came out in the final week, which I had kind of thought was factored in and that people had already considered in Pitt's draft cost, that was not expensive in any way, shape, or form, but was just this idea that the offense wasn't going to really emphasize Pitts. It's like, it's not going to emphasize any of those guys, right? It's going to be about Bijan Robinson and Tyler Algier. Drake London is so good, or he has enough upside. He has the ability to get open for a big receiver that, he's going to have some big games. And so I don't think you're going to get to the end of the season if you drafted him and say this is the one guy who lost you your league, because most of the teams that they play, frankly, are just going to be much, much, much better than the Carolina Panthers. One of the things I think came out of this game is that the Panthers are further away maybe than I thought. You and I did a show on the rookie quarterbacks, and I haven't had a chance to watch the Houston game, so I don't know about Stroud. Bryce Young in the second half today, Bryce Young looked good, right? And yet look good in a way where it's going to take him a while, like it takes a lot of the rookie QBs to actually do anything, in part because he has 0 weapons. We almost got a Laviska Shenault touchdown early in the game, and that was like the best looking play they had in the entire game.
Terrace Marshall had a catch early too that looked kind of nice, and those guys didn't play a ton in August. They were banged up, but yeah, the fact that no one, I had the exact same takeaway. I was like, because I bet Bryce Young offensive rookie of the year over at Stealing Lions, and I was like, man, I'm already kind of regretting that. He was 5-1, and I think he was pretty clearly the best quarterback to play. Bijan was the odds-on favorite at the time, and I assume still is. But I was watching that game, and I was like, I both think Young still looks good, and also think that he is going to have a hard time winning that award because this offense is not going to be very good for him.
And if anything, today might overstate some of the things, because for the most part, the Falcons did not try to pressure him. And so he's standing back there for a long time at different periods and still can't find anybody. And one of the things I thought was, unfortunate, but maybe not unexpected, was that he did put some balls up deep where, probably a lot of it is on him, but he obviously didn't want to make a mistake. And yet there just was no explosiveness from either Marshall or Mingo as they try to run under those balls. Obviously some of this is just, the first week is so tough because everybody on like 90% of their takes, they think that whatever happened confirms kind of what they had been telling people. And then the other 10%, they're sort of terrified of because it looks like it could be very far off. Right. But it's actually going to be worse than that as the season goes along. We're not going to be right on 90% of the things either. Some of the things you feel like you were right about today are going to turn out to be incorrect. But I was joking with Colum on one of our drafts when we were stashing Jameson Williams, and both when you watch how the Lions looked in week 1, you can understand why, if they're going to accomplish their objectives, Williams has to actually be a big part of it because those other guys after Amon-Ra are egregiously bad. But also, when you look at Bryce Young and how he's throwing some of these passes up there, he's thinking to himself, like, good golly. I mean, these players are so much less athletic than Jameson Williams was when I was just tossing the ball up and he was running for a bunch of 75-yard touchdowns. So on both sides of it, I mean, that type of athleticism is not easy to replace. And I do think that the Panthers team is well coached. I think that they're going to grow with him. I think there are going to be some good things for them this season. There were points in this game where, because of what Arthur Smith is doing, where you're like, I kind of think the Panthers are going to win. Then that goes away because the Panthers were so bad in the third and fourth quarters. But I mean, he looked pretty cool. And the flip side of that was you have this Indianapolis Colts game where they're able to accomplish so much in the first sort of 2/3 of that game and manage Anthony Richardson's strengths and weaknesses in such a way that, I mean, they looked like they might very well take out the Jaguars. But as soon as there was a little pressure for him to throw an NFL pass, and this isn't like just on him or anything like that, there were about a third of the NFL teams who either didn't ask their quarterback to throw what I would consider like a traditional NFL pass, or on the handful of occasions that they asked them to, their quarterback wasn't able to, right? So this isn't just Anthony Richardson specifically. But there were 3 or 4 passes late in that game where the accuracy scattering report from college really jumped out at you because you're just not used to seeing an NFL quarterback miss a pass by like yards and both long and wide. And again, it's not, we shouldn't hold him to a higher standard in his first NFL game than we would hold superstars like Deshaun Watson, who was on the winning end of an easy victory and yet looked absolutely terrible. And
other than running the ball, but yeah, throwing the football struggled.
And then Joe Burrow, who couldn't even throw the ball across the line of scrimmage. And
so you make that.
You don't hold like rookies into the first game to a higher standard than superstars. Right. I mean, it's week 1 can be tough.
Yeah, I think you're totally right about the Richardson thing. There was pros and cons there. They played fast. He throws 37 passes or something, which, again, like Ritter threw, I think, fewer than half as many passes as Richardson did in his first ever game. And I expected Richardson to be running a ton. Speaking of the Stealing Lions bets, Dalton found a fun one that was an alt line on Richardson's rushing that was like 10-1 for him to run for 100 yards. And I put some money on that one too while we were down in Vegas. Like, let's go for it. Like, I thought they would just be calling zone reads all game, and it's either Richardson or the running back, but he throws 37 passes in an offense like that.
I mean, if you have a lot of Richardson in fantasy, and you can certainly see why people would, even though I don't think either one of us does. But if you have that, you were actually pretty disappointed by the rushing, especially after the early rushing touchdown, that everything really, like, there was nothing after that. And that has to be a big part of what they do.
It does, but the pace and the volume, the play volume in this game, both teams, I have in my notes, I hope this is right, ran 69 plays each, which is a ton. They're not going to run 69 plays every game, which is part of the reason you're pointing out that Richardson does need to run more. He's not going to throw 37 pass attempts a game, but it is promising that they can get there. That's a number that we haven't seen Atlanta get to. And
I mean, you have a coaching staff there that eventually wants to win the Super Bowl, whereas you have a coaching staff in Atlanta that eventually wants to go 8-9.
Did you see the quotes? Falcons coach Arthur Smith told that Drake London had, this is from Greg Allman, who's a great beat reporter. We've had him on RotoViz Radio before. Told that Drake London had 1 fewer reception than Desmond Ridder in today's win. Let the fantasy guys worry about that. We've got to clean some things up. We don't care. Drake London doesn't care. All we care about is 1-0.
I mean, anybody on the planet who thinks that Drake London doesn't care, who thinks that Drake London isn't seething even more than fantasy owners tonight, is in complete and total denial about like anything about what it is to be human or to like believe in yourself and your craft. Because
you think he's happy he's run blocking well all game?
Well, that would be like us doing all of these shows and writing all of these articles all season long, and then like not being allowed to draft any teams or not being allowed to talk about fantasy football once the season started. And then mean, thankfully, neither one of us actually have bosses, but some theoretical boss being like, oh, they don't care. And you're like, they don't care. Like, what are you talking about?
You were talking. I also wanted to circle back to Bryce Young real quick, though, as we're talking about the young guys, and then another broad macro point I want to make real quick. But on Bryce Young, you were talking about him not having the athleticism, not having the playmakers. There was a moment in this game, Jonathan Mingo, who actually is a pretty athletic player, and Mingo and Young have worked together a lot this offseason because some of the other receivers have been banged up, and Mingo played quite a bit in the preseason. He ran a very basic out pattern, and Young put it on him, and he caught it, and it was just, first down, 10, 11-yard gain or whatever. But the camera panned to Young, and he was like very seriously saying, good, 4-letter word starts with an S, right? And then he kind of says it again, right? And I was like, I'm not trying to make too much out of this, but I think when you play with other athletes that you trust to do the right things and make a normal catch on a normal 8-yard out, you probably don't go out of your way to tell them good job emphatically with a cuss word twice in a row. It's kind of like you are really trying to drive home that, hey, you did that one. Like, I mean, it doesn't, I don't know. It's just a quick out. Like do you really gotta that emphasize
that like Tyreek Hill is going to celebrate everything that he does, and he did a lot. But like, if you asked him afterward if it was anything special, he'd be like, no, that's normal play for me. Right. Which is like the gap between where a team like the Panthers is and where a team like the Dolphins is. It's a progression. It's not going to happen overnight.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the point I was making with the compliment, like the good job compliment, is more that there's probably a lot of other moments where Young is talking to Mingo after the play and saying, I actually need you to break 2 yards shorter and to get out of your break quicker. You rounded it off too much and this and that. And so, it was like that time it was right. Good job. That's what I need you to do. Anyway, the macro point, Shawn, we talked a lot this offseason about cover 2 shells and the different offenses and what's going to happen. The great podcast series from Jordan Rodriguez, the play callers, which was a really interesting look into where we are evolving as a league. You talked about the Chiefs looking terrible. I did see a stat that was couched as or used to try to be positive about Sky Moore, who I don't really have much reason to be positive about Sky Moore at this particular moment, but that he, I guess I can't remember where I saw this, but I guess did well against man coverage last year, but in that first game, and the Lions ran, I think, a lot of man last year, but they ended up running more zone, more cover 2 shells against the Chiefs then. And so the point was, okay, well, it wasn't really a great defensive look for what Sky has won against in his short career, but it was also pointing out that they ran a bunch of cover 2 shells, and their whole thing was, we're going to keep everything in front. Have to assume that some of what the Bengals were facing, I mean, that may have been some of what even like a Ritter was facing with a lot of his checkdowns and underneath throws. But to your point earlier that a lot of quarterbacks around the NFL looked bad in week 1, that is something that I thought about a lot. And I thought about it on Thursday night with the Lions and Chiefs. I took the over in that game, and the over didn't hit. Part of the reason it didn't hit, it didn't seem like either quarterback was really able to push the ball downfield. They were kind of being forced into that longer, slower drives, and then things can happen. You can have the fumble that the Lions had early in that game in the red zone. It is a trickier way to play, and we've talked about this on the show over the last couple of years, Shawn, as this has evolved, but needing to build these long, slow drives. I mean, to some degree, it's almost less enjoyable to watch, I guess, when you're a big fantasy football player as well. Like I watched a lot of week 1 and thought, man, we are back into some of the weeks in 2022 that were pretty frustrating, where you're not getting the offense, you're not getting the big plays, because defenses are just trying to stop the explosives. That's their whole goal.
I think we can get there, though, and I think that we will get there, at least in part. That Lions-Chiefs game could have gone a shootout if the receivers hadn't played so poorly. Because, I mean, Sky Moore, number one, doesn't get open. And then number two, doesn't I mean, one of the things with Jonathan Mingo is that you look at his trajectory in college and you watch him play, and it's really hard to see where that tested athleticism is. At the NFL level, at least, it's been really difficult to see where the tested athleticism is for Sky Moore, because obviously he tested decently. Yeah. Obviously, beyond that, you have some fluky kind of plays where Kadarius Toney had the type of game that is just like a 1 in a million type of game. Now, Kadarius Toney is not some great player by any stretch, but the mistakes that he made in that game, I mean, you couldn't really do if you tried to do it on purpose. I mean, you just wouldn't play that bad again. And then, if anything, Marvin Jones was worse, and it just gets covered up a little bit because the Lions won. Right. Mm-hmm. I mean, Marvin Jones was fumbling the ball or lateraling it to the defense or dropping like 2-yard completions throughout the game. And so you can be more dynamic. And then you have a situation where the Chiefs thought that employing their terrible running backs instead of Jarrett McKinnon would help them win that game. And then you have a situation where the Lions give a ton of touches to a running back who averages fewer yards per carry than CEH. Those are things that can be changed. And the Lions have a back in Jahmyr Gibbs who didn't get the volume, and he fell down when he was going to score this cool touchdown.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so as opposed to like Bijan Robinson, where we can say like everything that we thought about him is already coming true. With Gibbs, you're not quite there yet because it didn't actually come true in the first game, in part because of his usage.
But I left the game excited. Yeah,
he looked faster than I thought he was going to be. Both of those guys I thought were going to be game-changing athletes, and both of them were more impressive than I thought they were going to be. And so with the Lions, I mean, you're going to have to make some moves. You can't keep doing what you're doing with that. That's gross and broken.
Gibbs is a guy I took in drafts with the ship chasing guys after the Thursday night game when we were in Vegas. Another one that you just mentioned that I did actually think was slightly bullish and go take after the game was Kadarius Toney. He only ran 11 routes, got 5 targets, couldn't catch anything, but also with the way that Sky Moore looked in that game, like, and you have MVS running as many routes as he is. As soon as Kadarius Toney's ready to run 20 plus routes, he's probably going to get that many targets again. Like, they need him. He's getting open.
I had a couple of drafts where I was really disappointed that he got picked like one spot ahead of me.
He didn't.
The other guy, and partly again, you talk about after week one, everybody on 90% of the things is going to think that, what they thought before was right. But I mean, Rashee Rice is the best receiver on that team. And he's going to score a lot.
Yeah.
So I mean, one of the things that happened in that game, and one of the things I think we saw happen in week one, and I even think that it happened to an extent in the Broncos game where they looked so good in the first half, the defenses made adjustments, and then the offenses reacted by not using their playmakers, especially if those guys were inexperienced. And so we saw Rice make some good plays early in that Chiefs game, and then because of some of the defensive adjustments, they actually did the thing they said they were going to do before the game, which is to make those guys very niche players in certain packages. And as a result, the Chiefs stopped moving the ball. I mean, you think about how Marvin Mims was involved in the Broncos game, despite the fact that they don't have Jerry Jeudy out there. I think that it's a very positive sign for Jeudy and Mims for the long term that in the first half, Russell Wilson looked basically back to himself. You think about the game that the Chargers looked, phenomenal in so many ways, but lose, and they lose in part because they don't have Quentin Johnson in the game, and they do have guys like Mike Williams who just doesn't add anything out there running a bunch of routes. And so one of the reasons I think we're going to see better football and more exciting football as the season develops is that some of these guys who were drafted to make big plays are going to start making them. And, we have a game where a late round draft pick who had been actually very buzzy, but if you get the results that you get from the Rams rookie for JSN, then we're going to think he's like the greatest player of all time.
Yeah.
Right. So these things are going to develop. The Seahawks, who, I mean, it was kind of cool because Kenneth Walker looked fantastic, But I mean, Geno Smith, one of the positives with him is he's been so good, all last season. And now you get another, very good player. And yet they were completely befuddled in the passing game. I mean, these things are going to change. One of the things that was exciting is that Matthew Stafford now a little bit healthier. You were like, oh yeah, I mean, Matthew Stafford has some pretty serious arm talent.
Yeah. Sean McVay's a good coach. Like this is actually can work. I mean, it's funny. I was pretty out on Tutu and Puka and some of those guys, but I also made the case a lot in August that I didn't think McVay and Stafford were just going to pack it up, and this idea that their whole season was just going to immediately implode. I was like, that's what happened last year, but that was coming off a year where they played 21 games the year prior, and there might have been a little bit of a Super Bowl hangover. McVay was thinking about retiring after he wins the Super Bowl, and they're not maybe as super motivated, and then they get some injuries, and they're like, yeah, we are kind of thin. They did lose a lot of talent this offseason. They obviously had pushed in all the chips to get that Super Bowl run. But you also had to be like, look, their motivation is going to be different this offseason. They don't want to just suck forever after their Super Bowl. There's a reason there's a Super Bowl hangover, and you play a lot of games deeper into February. You have a shorter offseason, and you're maybe not as motivated to get right back in the film room the very next day. And then you have a really difficult season like they did. And McVay, when you listen to that podcast series, I just talked about the play callers, went through some tough stuff in the locker room and with some of his other coaches and things. And he's like, I'm not going to be that way anymore. Had to work on his mental health and some of those things, but not all that surprising to me that when you have a quarterback like Matthew Stafford and an offensive line mind like Sean McVay, that they come out and actually they look sharp. They have some answers, right, for the 2023 landscape, even if it is with guys that we didn't really expect to be superstars in Puka Nacua and Tutu Atwell that are doing really well. Obviously, Van Jefferson couldn't get involved. He's unfortunately, still struggling. But Puka Nacua and Tutu Atwell had really strong games. The other team, obviously, that had answers, also featured in that Play Callers podcast, was the Dolphins. And you talk about the, explosive big play guys are going to start making the plays. Well, I mean, I was thinking about Tyreek Hill as you said that. He looked like that dude. And yeah, I mean, I was leaning Cup over Tyreek for most of the offseason, so I have a lot of Cup. But we also took a decent amount of Tyreek. That if you have Tyreek early, you have to feel really content. But as you noted, also Tua, Sean.
Well, there'd be no way to go back and take Jamar Chase over Hill.
Over Hill.
I mean, just one game.
Yep.
You don't want to overstate what happened, but those things are so far on the opposite ends of the spectrum, and it is meaningful. And one of the things is we have a lot of Waddle, and he obviously didn't have the big game. But if anything, I'm more excited for him than I was before the day started, because, I mean, if you can throw for like 500 yards, then the yards are coming. The touchdowns are coming.
For me,
his speed has not changed.
Yeah, obviously Tyreek is the huge win, but I was thinking, man, what are the teams where I have some combination of all, of those three, of Tyreek, of Tua, and of Waddle as well, because they did that and they traded big games a little bit last year. And yeah, obviously Tyreek had the bigger season than Waddle, but the idea of taking both Tyreek and Waddle that high was how concentrated the volume was between those two last year. And it was, again, pretty concentrated. They got some other guys involved. It's kind of interesting.
I thought it was encouraging that those players were able to make the plays to keep the drives alive, so that Hill and Waddle are going to be able to get the stuff done.
Braxton Berrios, River Craycraft catches a T. Jerome Smythe gets targeted several times and looks like he could be an interesting tight end even. But yeah, exactly. Those guys, you need the ancillary players. It can't just be the two players. But clearly, they're not going to cut into Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. It's going to be everything that Tyreek and Waddle can take, they will get in an offense that looks great. I mean, that's the defense that really stifled them last year, late in the season. Everyone talked about how they struggled in the last 5 games or whatever. Their really bad game was the one in Los Angeles against Brandon Staley's defense, who's another guy from that, play callers coaching tree. He had answers from Mike McDaniel and the way that they were attacking on the in-breaking routes. And Tua wasn't able to hit the outbreaking routes. He completed 10 passes in that game. He was 10 for 24. Really, really poor game late in the year. And then he just went and put up these huge numbers against the same thing. So the question for this year with the Dolphins was, Was anything a little bit gimmicky last year? Will McDaniel have more answers? Well, he went up against a defensive coordinator that stifled him late last year, and he had more answers clearly. So, I mean, that's got to be really bullish.
And so we go through a week one where, I mean, it's not just 4 teams, but there were 4 teams that we were very heavily invested in for sure. And those teams would be the Dolphins and the 49ers and the Seahawks and the Steelers. And so you get 2 big wins and 2, I don't know if you can call them big losses, but probably you could call them big losses. So we'll see kind of how this evolves over the next 2 or 3 weeks. I didn't think that this was a great way for the Steelers to go into the season playing the 49ers defense. So that part had worried me a little bit. And then if you know that during the comeback time, Deontay Johnson's going to be out with a hamstring injury, I mean, he's a very crucial part of that. As soon as he went out, you're like, well, really now these guys are not going to get open. So, and you got to see the circus catch from Pickens, but out of bounds.
Yep.
The Seahawks one in some ways is less egregious, but it's also worrying. I think you have a little bit of a concern there with Lockett. JSN did not do anything or look good today. I guess I'm not that concerned about either of the teams yet, but we do need them to perk up over these next couple of weeks.
Yep. You mentioned the Niners as well, though. And again, the playmakers making plays. Brandon Ayuk was the drumbeat guy all offseason. He looked good. That route on his first touchdown got the cornerback. I mean, he went right at him, right, and did the little option route, broke in, got the cornerback basically falling over, breaking his ankles, and creates just a ton of separation in the end zone for an easy throw. And then his second TD is a contested catch at the front pylon that's a really tight window throw, and he gets physical and makes that play. And that's, I mean, you love to see, obviously, the route running and the ability to get open, but also then the contested catch ability. Like that's the range of everything that you need to do as a wide receiver. He put it all on display. You can see why he's been getting hype all offseason from his teammates, from his coaches, from every beat reporter. Definitely excited to have him on teams. Christian McCaffrey reminded us that he's Christian McCaffrey. Debo looked good, I thought, too.
So
I mean, I immediately thought I'd rather have more Ayuk than Debo, but then Debo would make some plays, and I'd be like, oh, he looks good, too.
He's going to have some just massive eruption games. He's going to have a game or two that reminds people of what Tyreek Hill did today. Probably the best moment of draft season at this point, as I kind of think back, is that moment where we were able to get Christian McCaffrey at the 106 for the Chasing Stolen Bananas team. So that's one that, sort of offsets that Dobbins situation. And yeah, I mean, off to the races. Ben, this was such a fantastic week one. Enjoyed this conversation with you so much. Can't wait to do some more of these. We may do them many weeks, not necessarily every week. We'll just kind of have to see how it all develops. But I'd like to thank all the listeners so much for everything leading into the season. I hope you had the kind of week one that you needed, or at least generated some excitement. And I mean, just it feels good for football to be back. Good luck to everybody tonight. Obviously, we're recording this Sunday night, but you're listening sometime on Monday. If you need Breece Hall, hopefully he plays more than a couple snaps. If you need Garrett Wilson, hopefully he goes for, I mean, why not? But like 15,203, right? Get you all the way back from whatever your margin is. Good luck to everybody. This has been Stealing Bananas. I'm Shawn Siegele. With me, as always, is Ben Gretch. You can follow him at Yards Per Gretch. The peak stealing signals time of the year is here. The next couple days is going to be huge for Ben. Make sure you get over there and check those out. Absolute must-read stuff there over the next couple of days. We'd also love to have you guys over at RotoViz. Want to save a little bit on that subscription? Use the coupon code RVRated2023 at checkout. We love you guys. We'll talk to you soon.